Okay, so we are live now. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another lecture organized by Voyages into the Past Otit Probaho. First of all, wishing our audience a very happy 75th Independence Day. And on this auspicious day, our topic for the lecture couldn't have been more apt. It is titled Netaji's Discovery of India, which will be delivered by Dr. Somshankar Ray, Assistant Professor of History, Vidyasagar College for Women. Dr. Ray received his Ph.D. from the University of Calcutta. Besides teaching history, he is also an essayist and writer. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose evokes various emotions within our minds: valor, fearlessness, and patriotism. However much we hear about him, our interest hardly gets fulfilled. So, without any further delay, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In 2021, we are observing the 125th year of birth of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Also today, 15th August 2021, is the 75th anniversary of our independence. So it is a matter of great privilege to speak on Netaji and his understanding of Indian history on the day of India's independence, to secure which he sacrificed all. Here, you may remember that in 1929, the Indian National Congress had to adopt the resolution of Purna Swaraj, or absolute independence, on the insistence of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And in 1943, 21st October, Netaji inaugurated the first ever independent government of the Indians, Arze Hukumate Azad Hind, which was recognized by a number of independent countries. I cordially thank the Voyages into the Past organization for creating this opportunity. Netaji Subhash Bose is commonly remembered as a brave, uncompromising fighter against the British Raj. His intellectual activities come less into focus. Even a contemporary scholar, Ramchandra Guha, rated Netaji a doer or a man of action rather than a far-sighted thinker. However, this is a sadly incorrect view. One just has to take a look at his books, essays, and letters, a considerable literary corpus, to appreciate that Netaji was a remarkable visionary man of letters. He was a brilliant student, and his brilliance was evident in his letter writings and speeches. Unfortunately, his works are not widely read, and he did not receive the recognition bestowed on Nehru and Radhakrishnan as political philosophers. Amongst the books authored by him for practitioners of history, the most important is The Indian Struggle 1920 to 42. This book is his study of the Indian independence movement. It is enriched by Netaji's reflections on the key themes in Indian history. This book was written in two phases. The first phase, Indian Struggle 1920 to 34, was written while he was in exile in Europe. The second phase, dealing with the period between 1935 and 42, was composed when he was again in Europe trying to raise the Indian National Army and the Indian Legion. As a work of history and political philosophy, this volume is more compact and cogent than similar works by other Indian leaders like Nehru's Discovery of India. Sadly, Netaji's book was banned in India till 1948 and did not receive much publicity. However, outside India, newspapers like Manchester Guardian and intellectuals like Romarola praised this work as the best by an Indian politician. Along with the Indians, the book addressed the interested foreign audience. Primarily for them, Netaji provided a narrative on Indian history in the introduction section. Here, at first, he stated that historical research in India matured between 1900 and 1930. However, before this, the British succeeded in creating a prejudiced view of Indian history. Their interpretations and readings were rather harmful for the Indians as they created communal and sectarian divisions. Then he stressed unity in diversity among the Indians. For him, the most important binding factor for the diverse groups of Indians was Hinduism. Shankaracharya's four ashramas in the four corners of the subcontinent stressed our fundamental unity. He also noted that Indian civilization had a remarkable continuity from 3000 BC. However, he held the Harappan civilization as a pre-Aryan one and the Aryans as conquerors. He bestowed high praise on the liberal political atmosphere of the Vedic times. This was proved by the existence of the Sabhas, the Samitis, and the republican non-monarchical forms of government. Though liberal, the Indians had the concept of a politically united authority in their minds. This is proved by the use of the terms Chakravarti Kshetra and Mandaleshwara. This concept got concretized from the 6th century BC, and the ideal was achieved under the Mauryas in the 3rd century BC. Here we may recall the words of Dijendralal Rai or D.L. Rai, the famous Indian poet, who was the father of Dilip Kumar Rai, the dear friend of Netaji and a great philosopher and scholar in his own right. D.L. Rai wrote, Ashok Jahar Kirti Chailo Gandhar Hote Jalodhishesh. That is, under Ashoka, the entire subcontinent, stretching from Gandhara in the northwest to the shores of the Indian Ocean and beyond, was united under one system. Though the government was monarchical then, public administration reached a very high level. Egalitarian Buddhism was the state religion. However, it soon declined owing to exaggerated asceticism. Netaji praised the cultural renaissance under the Guptas and Harsha, but marked the revival of orthodox Brahminism. He repeatedly stressed the presence of egalitarian republicanism in ancient India, a fact deliberately ignored by the British historians. This is proved by the terms Gana, Paura, Janapada, and the existence of the caste republics and the autonomous village republics, even in the monarchical states of South India. Then he came to the controversial Muslim phase in Indian history. He used the term Mohammedan invaders within quotes, but generally had a positive impression of the Muslim rule. He mentioned the attempt towards political unification of the subcontinent under Muhammad bin Tughlaq and the cultural synthesis under Akbar. He claimed that the Indians generally enjoyed complete religio-cultural freedom under the Muslim rulers. Then he briefly discussed the 18th century post-Mughal anarchy and the arrival of the Europeans. In the later paragraphs, he made a brilliant compact discussion on the various administrative acts and reforms bills of the British government in India between 1765 and 1930. Then in the section, The New Awakening in India, he dealt with the important themes of the British conquest and the rise of patriotic spirit in India. He tried to explain their causes. He said significantly that Indian society did not have a sense of exclusiveness, so it had no aversion towards foreigners. India was a vast and very populous land and could easily absorb the foreigners who were always rather limited in numbers. Naturally, the Indians welcomed the early Europeans. Here we can refer to the case of Pratapaditya, one of the Baro Bhuyas or the powerful zamindars of medieval Bengal. He was the ruler of Jessore in southern Bengal. When the Portuguese arrived in Jessore, he welcomed them enthusiastically. He and his son Udayaditya even selected a site for the construction of a Portuguese church. Owing to this lack of consciousness, the Indians even took help from the Europeans in political and military affairs. This is in contrast with Afghanistan, Tibet, Nepal, and to some extent China. These societies were more exclusive in nature and thus could preserve their independence to a great extent even during the golden age of colonialism in the 19th century. And you may note that even today, even in 2021, it is so difficult to dominate Afghanistan. Even the American soldiers had to leave Afghanistan, and once again the Afghans are fighting amongst themselves. The Europeans, who were militarily advanced, took advantage of this Indian mentality, especially after the decline of the Mughal Empire. Netaji praised Siraj-ud-Dawla of Bengal as the only Indian ruler who could vaguely realize the nature of the British menace at an early stage. Actually, in our formal textbooks, Siraj is never given the credit for a singular military achievement. He was the only Indian ruler who successfully captured a British presidency. In 1756, Siraj captured Calcutta and renamed it Alinagar. Later, even the famous Hyder Ali and the formidable Marathas failed to capture either Madras or Bombay. So, in the heydays of British imperialism, Siraj remained the only Indian ruler who successfully captured one of their major seats of power. However, in the textbooks, Siraj is not given due credit for this achievement. Unfortunately, the other Indians lacked this consciousness and gradually fell victim to the British aggression. Then Netaji dwelt on the impact of the British rule on the Bengali society. He provided the familiar narrative of the Macaulay effect, the reforms under Brahmo Samaj, and the revival under uh, Arya Samaj and Ramakrishna Mission. However, he credited Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, and Ramakrishna Mission with the arousal of self-respect and sense of purpose amongst the Indians. According to him, by 1830s, the Indians largely realized that the British would always rule India as an alien power in its own interest and won't be absorbed in the Indian society unlike earlier foreigners. This feeling of alienation led to the massive rebellion of 1857. Netaji interestingly claimed, I quote, "It was by no means merely a revolt of the sepoys, a sepoy mutiny, but a real national revolution, a revolution in which both the Hindus and the Mohammedans joined, and they all fought under the flag of a Mohammedan. We all know later too, Netaji identified the rebellion of 1857 as the beginning of the Indian struggle for independence. He even visited and garlanded the tomb of Bahadur Shah, the last Mughal, in Rangoon. Then he touched upon the spread of the Renaissance spirit to western and southern India and noted the end of the East India Company's government in 1858 and the direct takeover of the Indian affairs by the British Crown. By the early 20th century, the British government ruled India like a distant alien force with a complicated machinery. It revealed its lack of sensitivity or even dislike for the Indians by partitioning Bengal, politically the most conscious and vociferous province, in 1905. Then Netaji briefly discussed the Swadeshi movement and the political trends, especially the moderate extremist differences. While rounding off the historical introduction, Bose interestingly placed the Indian freedom struggle in the global context. He said, within quotes, Indian movement is organically connected with the world movement for liberty. Then he mentioned the anti-British struggle of the Boers, the early Russian revolutions, and the awakening of Japan. However, rather interestingly, the Boers oppressed the Negroes as well, and the Negroes, like the Zulus, had to wage anti-imperialist struggle against the Boers too. This Netaji did not mention. Here, we can compare Netaji with Sri Aurobindo and Seer Dash, who too had extremely good grip over global affairs and wrote incisive articles on the international scenario. Netaji said that nationalism became a force in the world everywhere from the beginning of the 19th century. This made the Indians increasingly nationally conscious. Another interesting feature of this discourse was Netaji's attempt to identify some general trends for Indian history. He said that in India, one phase of development was followed by a period of decline. Then fresh energy was infused by foreign elements who came from outside, who were politically and militarily superior. He meant invaders from the northwest and from beyond the seas. However, he said that all these foreign elements were completely absorbed within the Indian body politic, and only the British remained an exception to this rule. Only the British remained an alien presence in India. Netaji's broad worldview was again evident in his discussions on contemporary world ideologies. He picked up the thread of historical narrative in a later chapter, India since 1857, a bird's eye view. Here he once again called the happenings of 1857 a revolution or war of independence. According to him, the greatest mistake the Indians made after 1857 was to accept disarmament meekly. For him, the British were the root of all evils in India, as he said in this chapter. According to him, they used, within quotes, bribery, treachery, and corruption for conquering India. After 1857, They vigorously pursued the policy of divide and rule. They pampered the inefficient, reactionary native princes. They invented and fanned the Hindu-Muslim divide, especially after 1906. During the time of the writing of this book, the British were encouraging the high caste low caste divide. However, the elections of 1937 showed that nationalism was the dominant feeling amongst all types of Indians. Then he strongly criticized the upcoming idea of Pakistan. He pointed out that even according to Jinnah, Pakistan could be sustained only with British help. Here we may recall the consistent British and American support for Pakistan in global affairs in contemporary politics. So, according to Netaji, the Indians were basically united. They had no real differences among themselves. Only the British invented certain differences, instigated some of the groups to rebel against this basic unity of the Indians and created confusion in India so that their rule could continue. After 1857, the Indians could carry on the nationalist struggle only by constitutional means. In this respect, the creation of the Indian National Congress in 1885 was very important for him because it brought all the educated opinion in India on one platform. However, by the beginning of the First World War, constitutionalism too had obviously failed. So, after the First World War, when the possibility of another armed revolution was gone and constitutionalism was dead, Gandhi provided fresh hope to the Indians with his method of passive resistance. Under Gandhi, Indian National Congress became a disciplined political organization reaching the remotest villages, thus creating the basic structure of a future independent state administration. Thus, in these paragraphs, Bose acknowledged the contribution of Gandhi. However, he concluded by saying that Gandhi's method at best could partly paralyze administration, but to overthrow it actually, physical force was absolutely necessary. And according to him, so the youth of India were actively moving towards armed revolution. It is interesting to note how Netaji interpreted armed nationalism or Biplobi Andolan in Bengal, his home province. Generally, we associate him with this movement by rating him as the supreme armed revolutionary. He was the ultimate Biplobi or the ultimate armed revolutionary according to our popular assessment. So it's of particular interest to note how he viewed this particular movement. He discussed this movement in the chapter The Bengal Situation. At the very outset, he made it clear that armed nationalism was not an anarchist or a terrorist movement. The aim of the armed nationalists was revolution and the installation of a nationalist government. Now, why did this movement develop specially in Bengal? Reasons, according to Netaji, were first, the arrogant behavior of the British residents, especially the army-men, towards all types of Indians, including educated government officials and socially respected ones. Here we may recall the bitter experiences of Bankim Chandra and Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee in the hands of the British. Secondly, at an intellectual level, Macaulay and his imperialist disciples constantly proclaimed the Bengalis as effeminate cowards. Thirdly, the British rule had a civilized facade. The liberal moderate Indians too believed in their sense of justice and fair play. But with the rising nationalist consciousness among Indians, the British became increasingly authoritarian and often used brutal force to subdue legitimate Indian protests, as in the Swadeshi movement of 1905 and again in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919. Fourthly, the unsympathetic attitude of the British government towards the Bengali and broadly Indian youth between 1920s and 34. So, according to Netaji, the Bengali Bhadraloks were exposed to Western education and European culture the longest among the Indians. Naturally, they became conscious of the British discrimination. The Bhadralok youth came to the conclusion that only retaliation through physical force would bring the British to their senses. So they provided armed resistance to the British, especially from 1905. During the Great War of 1914 to 18, they under Rajbihari Bose and Bagha Jatin even made a desperate attempt to overthrow the British rule in 1915. However, it was not a very well-planned revolt and it failed. And as you all know, Bagha Jatin died fighting the British heroically in 1915, and Rajbihari took asylum in Japan, and there he continued the Indian struggle, and ultimately Rajbihari Bose and Netaji Bose were united in 1943. However, their movements in India in 1915 were not very well planned. But the attempts of the armed nationalists of Bengal earned respect for the Indians from the British. This movement again gained momentum around 1930. However, Netaji did not go emotionally overboard while assessing the armed nationalism. He practically considered that contemplating another revolution soon after 1915 was madness. He also rated the 1930 Chattogram youth unrest as local and rather small scale. He refused to accept the Marxist interpretation of unemployment and reduced income leading to armed nationalism. However, he said that increasing employment opportunities, especially in the government sector, might reduce youth radicalism. And Netaji actually called for a serious historical research on this phenomenon of armed nationalism. He said that only academic historical research is not enough, but actually a deep psychological research should be conducted on this subject. And he named some of the senior British scientists who held this view too. Closely linked to this was Netaji's detailed analysis of Deshbandhu Seer Dash's role in the freedom movement. This too has been neglected in conventional historiography, though by 1925, Seer Dash was the supreme Indian leader. But Netaji convincingly highlighted the role of Seer Dash in our bid for independence. He brought out Das's political maturity and administrative efficiency as the mayor. Das was the first Indian mayor of Calcutta, at that stage the premier city of British India, and Bose was the chief executive officer under him. And according to Bose, Das showed very effectively that the Indians could govern a significant and large entity quite efficiently. And at the same time, he installed a sense of self-belief among the Indian employees as well. Das's political foresight was evident in the forging of the Hindu-Muslim Pact in Bengal in 1923. Das was absolutely sure that you cannot ignore the Muslims as a significant factor in Bengal politics, though they were academically and culturally a bit behind even then, but their numbers definitely mattered. So it was always wise to come to terms with the Muslim factor. Netaji contrasted Das's sense of purpose and clarity of thought with Gandhi's vague idealism. However, he pointed out that Das and Gandhi were on extremely cordial terms. His British adversaries, that is Seer Das's British adversaries, like Lord Lytton and Lord Birkenhead, greatly admired him. Das realistically accepted dominion status as his goal, but at the same time utilized the armed nationalists who stood for absolute independence in the service of the Indian National Congress. It may be recalled that Maulana Azad, in his India Wins Freedom, too rated Seer Das as the greatest Indian leader of the modern times, and lamented that had he been alive, India would have gained freedom much earlier and as a united entity. In Netaji's book, we find a number of interesting anecdotes about contemporary politics, which are obviously not found in formal textbooks, like the international reaction to Gandhi's first unto death and the Pune Pact of 1932, and Lord Olivier's explanation of the rise of the Swaraj Party. Lord Olivier was the Secretary of State for India at that stage. A number of such observations and anecdotes are found in this book. So while concluding, we may say that Netaji had a sharp analytical mind and interpreted Indian history in a refreshingly different manner. Thank you. Soham, I can't hear you.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. Over the past half an year, what we heard was an excellent depiction of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's political ideas, his reflections on the Indian freedom struggle, and various insights into his thoughts and beliefs. Sir, I have a genuine question here. Before, if we can move to the question, so if you permit, I may ask that.
Yes, if it is not too complicated or too
No,
controversial.
no, no, sir. Sir, actually, my question is Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and his contributions hardly need any introduction in Bengal or in India as well. But in the international sphere, the Indian leaders of the Netaji's contemporary times, like Gandhi, Nehru, or Patel, are much more discussed. And even if we simply go by Google searches, these people have a much higher Google search than Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. So my question is, why is Netaji, unlike his contemporaries, is not so much discussed in the international sphere?
Uh, Interesting question, but the point is the answer has to be extremely straightforward and brutal. I will correct you a bit at first because
Yes,
Netaji's activities need no introduction in Bengal, true. But in India, it does need some introduction because till recently, Netaji's contributions were not highlighted in the central board textbooks, ICSE or CBSE. So actually,
yes,
they need quite a bit of introduction, not only in international sphere, even in national sphere,
national.
his great activities are not discussed. Just a few years back, one of our presidents, Pratibha Patil Madam, mentioned the names of the great Indian leaders according to her, for whom India gained its independence. and she forgot to mention the name of Netaji. And I think it is India Today, as far as I can remember, India Today once conducted a poll. You had to write a short essay on the most significant Indian according to you. And based on those essays, they will rate the greatest Indian of the 20th century. And they provided a short list of 6 Indians. Uh, it included Tendulkar, but it did not include Netaji. So even in India, Netaji's works do need introduction. The
Yes.
answer is very simple, because you generally avoid the person who speak the bitter truth. The um, the armed nationalists of Bengal, Seer Dash, and ultimately Netaji, who was the supreme armed nationalist produced by Bengal in India, all of them straightway attacked the British. With absolute clarity, they could realize that the overthrow of the British was their absolute goal, while the other Indian leaders whom you mentioned often took the path of conciliation. Naturally, the European intellectuals and the official circles in British India eulogized them, and naturally they criticized them and often kept silent on Das, Bose, and the armed nationalists, because they took the bitter, straight path. That's plain and simple.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful answer.
No, I'm not
So,
saying
as far as
I'm
the
not
question,
saying that Gandhi, Nehru, and Patel were without any qualities. They were certainly men of
yes,
quality. Bose himself said that the heart of the entire nation throbbed for Gandhi, just one
Gandhi.
person. So certainly they were men of quality. But they generally avoided that extremist path taken by the Bengali nationalists, including both.
Okay, okay. So, as far as our questions and answer session is concerned, we do not have any question from our audience as of now. We have just got a good evening comment for you, sir, from Madam Koel De.
Okay.
Perhaps the audience have also tried to back away from asking questions.
No, no, no. You all are interested students in history. You are intelligent. You are well read already. I will recommend to you some books
Yes.
on the armed nationalism of Bengal, which you should read. This book is an
Of,
absolute read. Netaji's Indian Struggle, 1920 to 42. This book, all of you must read. And there are some other books like Bangalir Bol বা বাঙালির সামরিক ইতিহাস by Rai Saheb Rajendralal Acharya, Bangalir Bahubal by Birendranath Ghosh, some works on Bengal revolutionaries by Hemanta Kumar Sarkar, Manmathonath Gupta, Dalia Rai, Amitabh Mukherjee, Professor M.A. Bach, some Ph.D. theses, and a recent work on Bengal volunteers, whose details I will give you later. And there are some autobiographies and memoirs, like those of Nirotsi Chaudhuri, the famous intellectual, Subhash Chandra Sengupta, the famous scholar of English, whose PhD thesis was checked by Bernard Shaw himself. Bernard Shaw himself was the examiner, and the subject of his thesis was Bernard Shaw. And you know, Bernard Shaw was an acid critic, but he rated Sengupta's thesis very highly. Sengupta, in his autobiography, provided a number of rich anecdotes regarding the Bengal armed nationalists, and he actually wrote a book, India Rests Freedom, which stressed on the contribution of the armed nationalists or the Biplovis. This is a very interesting book. It is there in the Presidency College library. You can read it. That's a very interesting work.
of course.
And there are autobiographies of Jadugopal Mukherjee and Sachindranath Sanyal and Pulin Bihari Das, who themselves were leaders of the armed nationalists. These books you should read. And one historian whom you all love to criticize, but who I think most faithfully followed that lonely, bitter path of truth, that is Dr. R.C. Majumdar, whom it's a fashion nowadays to criticize, but you should actually very carefully read his 3 volumes, India's Struggle for Freedom. Huge amount of data regarding these less known, less highlighted aspects of the freedom struggle are there in this work. So you should read this book. There are books specifically on the INA, like Major General S.C. Chatterjee's India's Struggle for Freedom and Indian National Army by K.K. Ghosh. These are available for free in the internet. S.C. Chatterjee's book is a big mammoth one. It is a delightful contrast to the attempts of Leonard Gordon and Nimai Sadhun Bose and Hugh Toy, which are actually endorsed by the official circles. Actually, the official circles, both in India and abroad, basically endorse books which do adopt certain conciliatory postures. The bitter but truthful works are actually avoided. But as students of history, you should read them, though they may not form part of your formal syllabus. And unfortunately, Netaji and the armed nationalists are even now rather neglected in the academic discourses and the syllabi. But this should be corrected. So these books, I think, you should
So
read.
the Indian struggle of Netaji, 1920 to 42, was perhaps his second book. The first book was an Indian pilgrim,
The
that
Indian
unfinished
Pilgrim, which you may call his partial
autobiography,
autobiography,
if I'm not.
which you can call his
Yeah,
partial
yeah,
autobiography. And there are a number of articles, letters written by him, which are also extremely incisive and critical. You should read them. As I said at the very outset,
yeah,
that Netaji is primarily rated as a brave and uncompromising fighter, but we do not rate him. Actually, we do not rate him at all as an intellectual. But his writings
yeah.
are absolutely fabulous. His English and his Bengali, his historical understanding, his deep readings, you should appreciate them as young students.
Yes. Meanwhile, we have some
Oh my
questions
God,
here.
I should
I
have
will put
run
them
away
up on the
earlier.
screen. So this is being asked by Shujata Chakraborty. She says, "Thank you so much, sir, for your interesting lecture. I have a question. Why Netaji's book was banned even after independence?"
I think you know better than me. Uh, I answered you in detail, and the answer holds good for this question also.
Yes,
That bitter truth is not always brought into light.
elaborate. Yes. Mohana Ghosh also has a similar question. She asks, "What steps you suggest should be taken to bring Netaji on the forefront of Indian history?"
Holding of seminars like this one more frequently, and uh, young students like you should write articles on Netaji and the armed nationalists frequently in academic journals.
Right. Sir, our member Aditya has a question for you.
Mhm.
He's asking in the private chat section. He asks, "Sir, common people, especially who are not the students of history, have a tendency to see Netaji and Nehru as a rival of each other. But both of them had wonderful contribution in the Congress. So, how a student of history should see the relationship between them?"
Good question. A very good question. Actually, as I was saying, that one should not really contrast Nehru and Netaji, Patel or Rajbihari, and like that. They all were men of qualities, men and women of qualities, actually. But unfortunately, provincialism in India is very strong. The provincial cultures are very prominent. They all came from different provinces. Nehru came from North India and basically was a Kashmiri. Patel was a Gujarati. Netaji was a Bengali Bhadralok. So their approaches towards life was essentially different. Their backgrounds too were different. Nehru was entirely schooled in England, while Netaji had his schooling in India. So, their outlook towards life was rather different. They varied, and therefore they often differed on various issues. So, and they all were human beings. Ultimately, you have to consider that even Gandhi, who was rated as a god by many of the Indians, even Seer Dash, we normally rate Seer Dash as a rival of Gandhi, but Seer Dash in open court rated Gandhi as good as Jesus Christ. And he said that the trial of Gandhi by the British should be compared to the trial of Jesus Christ conducted by Pontius Pilate. So they were human beings. All human beings have their shortcomings. They came from various provinces. Their backgrounds were different. So they differed on various issues. So we
Right.
should not label them as rivals, actually.
Also, sir, if I'm not wrong, in Netaji's INA, he had brigades named after Gandhi and Nehru.
Yes, of course. His brigades were named after Gandhi, Nehru, and Azad. And when the news
Azad, yeah.
reached India, uh, at least I have no information that they opposed this move. That Gandhi and Nehru said that no, you must not name your brigades after us. They
Yeah.
simply kept quiet. In fact, according to Azad, Gandhi was keeping a careful watch on the movements of the INA. Had the INA arrived without Japanese soldiers, Gandhi might have welcomed them, according to Azad.
Right. Thank you, sir, once again for this wonderful lecture. And before concluding, I would like to mention our next event, which will be held on the 21st of August, 6 p.m. onwards. It is another lecture titled Interaction with a Museologist, which is an interactive session with Dr. Moloy De, Assistant Professor, Center for Studies in Museology, University of Jammu. Thank
Thank
you,
you. I will be.
everyone,
Thank you. Thank you
for
for this
tuning with us this
wonderful evening.
evening. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.